On a warm Tuesday evening in June 1980, inside a quiet home in Yerevan, Armenia, a 22-year-old woman laughed while trying on a silk dress for her first movie audition. The air smelled of blooming jasmine, and her mother watched with pride from the doorway. They spent the night talking about her future stardom in Moscow. But as she stepped outside, a black car waited in the dark. The man who promised her fame was actually hunting for her blood. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel where we discuss the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format. Today we are going to look into 3 separate stories from the early 1980s that will make you want to check your locks twice tonight. We have a serial killer in the Soviet Union, a horrific wave of piracy on the high seas, and a night of celebration that turned into a literal cage of fire in the heart of Dublin City. As you settle in, listen to the rain hitting the roof and feel the warmth of your room. It is a good night to stay inside and away from the shadows that linger in the streets. If you enjoy these deep dives into the darker side of human history, please consider subscribing or leaving a tip to help keep these stories coming. We are a small community of mystery seekers, and your support means everything as we navigate these haunted corridors of the past together. Before we begin, please take the like button out for an exclusive screen test in a small soundproof room and then slowly drain its battery until it turns a pale shade of gray. Do not let it leave the building until the film has stopped rolling and the lights have gone out for good. It really helps the channel grow and it keeps the rain falling outside. Now, make sure you are safe because once we start this journey into the darkness, there is no turning back. I need you to take a moment right now to make sure your front door is locked and your windows are closed tight. Check the feed on your security camera if you have one, because the world can be a very different place once the sun goes down. We are about to slide into our first story, which takes us deep into the heart of the Soviet Union, during a time when monsters were officially said not to exist. Let us step into the cold streets of 1980 Moscow. On a heavy Saturday evening, February 23, 1980, a 30-year-old filmmaker named Valery Asratian invited a young woman into his private apartment in central Moscow for a secret screen test. The apartment was located in a gray concrete building that looked identical to every other structure on the block, but inside the walls held a darkness that the Soviet police had never encountered before. This was the beginning of a nightmare that stayed hidden. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was a place of strict order and secrets, where the government claimed that serial killers were a capitalist disease that did not exist in their society. This created a perfect hunting ground for a man like Valery, because no one was looking for a monster in their midst. The police were not trained to find patterns in disappearances, and the media was silent. This silence was the very thing that allowed a predator to thrive. Valery Asratian was a man who seemed to have everything the modern Soviet citizen could want. He was handsome, intelligent, and worked in the prestigious world of cinema. He walked with a confidence that drew people to him, especially young women who dreamed of escaping their mundane lives for the silver screen. He knew how to use his words to paint a picture of a future filled with fame and luxury. He was the golden boy of the Yerevan and Moscow social circles. Behind his charming smile, Valery was struggling with a deep sense of inadequacy and a dark obsession that he could not control. He spent his days editing film and his nights wandering the streets, looking for a certain kind of beauty that he could possess. He lived in a small apartment that was cluttered with cameras, lenses, and rolls of film, creating an environment that felt like a professional studio. It was a perfect lure for the trap he was about to set. One of his many victims was a young woman who had just moved to the city with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. She met Valery at a local cafe where he was sitting with a script in his hand, looking every bit like the successful director he claimed to be. He struck up a conversation with her, complimenting her unique look and telling her that she had the exact features he needed for his next big project. She felt like she had finally found her lucky break. They spent several days meeting in public places, discussing the character she would play and the scenes they would shoot. Valery was patient and kind, never making a move that would cause her to feel uncomfortable. He even introduced her to some of his supposed colleagues to build more trust. She started to see him not just as a director, but as a mentor who truly cared about her career. She had no reason to doubt the man who was offering her a path to the stars. And this is the part that she had absolutely no way of knowing as she walked up the stairs to his apartment for her final screen test. She thought she was about to step in front of a camera and prove her talent to the world. She did not know that there was no film in the camera, and that the director she admired had spent the afternoon preparing a very different kind of equipment. She was walking into a room that was designed to be her final stage and her final resting place. The apartment smelled of chemical developers and old paper when she stepped inside that evening. Valery greeted her with a warm drink and told her to relax while he set up the lighting in the main room. He talked about the importance of capturing her raw emotions and how the lighting had to be just right to highlight her eyes. She sat on a small stool, sipping the tea he had given her, feeling a slight bit of nerves as she prepared for the most important night of her life. What she did not notice was the way Valery was watching her from the corner of the room, his eyes fixed on her neck rather than her face. He kept talking, his voice a soothing hum that filled the quiet space, but his hands were busy with a small bag hidden behind a curtain. He told her that the test would involve some very intense scenes, and she needed to be completely still for the camera to catch the light correctly. She nodded, feeling a bit drowsy from the warmth. As the minutes ticked by, the young woman began to feel a strange heaviness in her limbs. She tried to lift her hand to set the cup down, but her fingers felt like lead. She thought it was just the stress of the audition finally catching up to her, or perhaps the room was a bit too warm. She looked at Valery and tried to tell him that she felt a little dizzy, but her voice came out as a faint whisper. He just smiled and told her that everything was going exactly as planned. Valery stepped toward her, but he was no longer holding a light meter or a script. In his hand was a heavy roll of tape and a long, thin needle that glinted under the studio lamps. He didn't rush. He moved with the precision of a doctor. She tried to scream, but her lungs refused to cooperate. She was trapped in her own body, watching as the man she trusted began to wrap the tape around her wrists. The silence in the apartment was now heavy and suffocating like a shroud. The transition from a professional film set to a chamber of horrors was so subtle that her mind struggled to process it. One moment she was an actress, and the next she was a specimen. Valery began to talk to her in a low voice, explaining that he needed her blood for his rituals. He believed that the essence of life was contained in the fluid, and that by consuming it, he could gain the creative energy he lacked. He spoke about it as if it were a scientific fact. I have covered a lot of dark stories over the years, but this one has a detail that haunts me most. Valery was not just a killer, he was a consumer. We often try to find a reason for such evil, some kind of trauma or logic, but sometimes there is none. He simply believed he was entitled to the lives of others to fuel his own vanity. It makes you realize that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who have convinced themselves that their cruelty is actually a form of art. The first tongue of the nightmare began when Valery used the needle to draw a small amount of blood from her arm while she was still conscious. He held the glass tube up to the light, admiring the deep red color as if it were a vintage wine. He told her that she was his masterpiece and that her beauty would now be preserved within him. She could only watch with wide, terrified eyes as he took a small sip, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulated satisfaction. As the night wore on, the escalation continued into the second tongue of horror. Valery began to use more violent methods to extract what he wanted. He was no longer the calm director. He was a frantic predator. The sounds of the apartment were limited to the soft clinking of glass and the heavy breathing of a man possessed by a singular, ghoulish goal. He didn't care about the pain he was causing. To him, she was no longer a human being with a mother and a future. The third tongue of the dark spiral was the most brutal of all. When the victim's body could no longer provide what he craved, Valery took her life. He did so with a cold efficiency that suggested he had done this many times before. Once the deed was done, he used his knowledge of anatomy to dismember the body, intending to dispose of the remains in the trash heaps across the city. He believed the secret police would never find her among the piles of Soviet waste and rubble. The forensic evidence found later would tell a story of calculated cruelty that shocked even the most hardened investigators. When the police finally searched his apartment, they found dozens of hidden film canisters. They expected to see movies, but instead they found records of his crimes. He had documented the slow decline of his victims, capturing their last moments on film as if it were a documentary. The investigators found traces of blood in his kitchen glassware. Valery Azratyan was eventually caught when one of his intended victims managed to escape and lead the authorities back to his gray concrete building. The Soviet justice system, which usually worked in total secrecy, was forced to confront the fact that they had a monster in their capital. He was tried behind closed doors, but the details leaked out into the underground, earning him the nickname of the Armenian Vampire. He showed no remorse during the entire legal process. In 1982, Valery was sentenced to death by a firing squad. The execution was carried out quickly, as the state wanted to erase the memory of his existence as fast as possible. They didn't want the public to know that such a person could exist within their borders. His name was scrubbed from official records for years, but the families of the missing women never forgot. They knew the truth long before the government was willing to admit it to the rest of the world. Today, as the dusty and classified archives of 2026 are slowly opened to the public, the case of Valery Esratian remains a dark chapter in Russian and Armenian history. The files are still partially classified, but researchers continue to study his psychological profile to understand how he operated undetected for so long. His apartment building still stands in Moscow, looking like any other residential block, but those who know the history avoid walking past it at night. The victims are remembered by small, private memorials in their homes. He didn't just want their faces on film, he wanted their life force in a glass. While the shadows of Moscow were filled with the silent screams of those who sought fame, a different kind of predator was waiting thousands of miles away in the open ocean. We are moving from the cramped, chemical-scented rooms of a Soviet apartment to the vast and lawless turquoise waters of the Gulf of Thailand. In that place, the horizon offers no hope, and the blue waves hide secrets that are just as red as the ones Valery left behind in the frozen Russian snow. During the humid monsoon season of 1981, a small, overcrowded wooden vessel carrying 64 refugees, including a 22-year-old mother named Nguyen Thi Lan, drifted into the turquoise waters of the Gulf of Thailand. The sun was a white-hot disk in a sky that felt like a heavy, wet blanket. They were miles away from any recognized shipping lane, and their engine had finally sputtered its last breath of oily smoke into the salt air. The boat was only 12 meters long, and it was packed so tightly that no one could move without bumping into a neighbor. The wood was soaked with salt, and the smell of human sweat and fear was overwhelming. Most of the passengers had been at sea for 5 days, and their fresh water supplies were almost gone. They were tired, hungry, and deeply afraid, but they were driven by a singular dream of finding a new life on the shores of Malaysia or Thailand. Nguyen Thi Lan sat in the middle of the boat, clutching her 3-year-old daughter to her chest. She could feel the child's heartbeat against her own, a rhythmic reminder of why they had left everything behind. They had sold their gold jewelry and hidden the few remaining pieces in the seams of their clothing. Every wave that hit the side of the boat felt like a hand reaching out to pull them down, but Lan kept her eyes fixed on the distant, blurry horizon. In her mind, Lan was already living in the future she had promised her daughter. She saw a house with a solid roof and a school where the sound of gunfire was replaced by the sound of children playing. This vision was the only thing that kept her from giving in to the despair that was visible on the faces of the older men around her. She believed that if they could just stay afloat for one more day, the universe would finally grant them the mercy they so desperately needed. The refugees on the boat were a mix of former teachers, shop owners, and farmers who had all risked everything for a chance at freedom. They shared their meager rations of dried rice and spoke in whispers about the families they had left behind. There was a sense of profound solidarity among them, a bond forged in the salt spray and the shared knowledge that they were all in this together. They were no longer strangers. They were a community bound by hope and survival. What most people do not realize is that the Gulf of Thailand was not just a body of water during this time. It was a transition zone between two worlds. For many, it was the final hurdle to overcome before reaching safety. Lan spent the long hours of the afternoon singing soft lullabies to her daughter, trying to drown out the sound of the waves slapping against the hull. She told the little girl about the beautiful birds and the tall trees they would see once they hit land. As the sun began to dip toward the water, a shout went up from the front of the boat. A thin line of black smoke was visible on the horizon, moving slowly toward them. The refugees stood up as much as waving pieces of white cloth and shouting for help. They thought their prayers had been answered. They saw a large fishing trawler, a sturdy vessel that looked like a fortress compared to their own fragile boat. It was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. The trawler was painted a bright blue, and it cut through the water with an ease that made the refugees weep with relief. They could see men on the deck, dark-skinned fishermen in straw hats, looking down at them. The refugees held up their empty water jugs to show their desperate need. They expected the larger boat to slow down and throw them lines, perhaps even pull them onto the safety of the wide wooden deck. It felt like the long nightmare of the ocean was finally over. Lan looked at the blue-green water and allowed herself to smile for the first time in weeks. She imagined her daughter going to a real school in a land where the sound of engines meant safety rather than war. She thought they had survived the worst of the journey. And this is the part that she had absolutely no way of knowing as she waved her hand at the approaching vessel. She thought she was being found by heroes, but she was being spotted by precious cargo. I often think about the sheer courage it takes to step onto a boat like that, with nothing but hope and a small child. Most of us cannot even imagine the desperation that makes the open ocean look safer than the land you were born on. It is a level of vulnerability that most people will never have to experience in their entire lives. We like to think that the world is a fair place, but the stories from the Gulf of Thailand in 1981 tell us otherwise. As the fishing boat got closer, the sound of its massive diesel engine began to vibrate through the floorboards of the refugees' vessel. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping that seemed to shake their very bones. The fishermen on the deck were not reaching for ropes or water buckets. Instead, they were standing perfectly still, watching the small boat with an intensity that felt cold. The air suddenly felt very still, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Lan noticed that the fishermen were not smiling back. Some of them were holding long metal bars, and others were sharpening large knives against the wooden railings of the trawler. The sound of the metal scraping against the wood was high-pitched and grating, cutting through the low hum of the engine. A strange smell began to waft over the water, a mixture of rotting fish and cheap tobacco that made Lan's stomach churn with a sudden, unexplainable sense of dread. She looked at the faces of the men on the trawler and realized they were not seeing people in need of help. They were looking at the refugees the way a hawk looks at a mouse in an open field. The self-deception that had kept her going for days began to crumble. She whispered to her neighbor that something felt wrong, but the man just told her it was the stress. He said they were just rough men who worked hard on the sea. He wanted so badly for that to be true. The first tongue of the nightmare began when the trawler did not slow down as it reached them. Instead, it swung its heavy bow around and slammed into the side of the small wooden boat. The impact was violent, throwing several people into the water and cracking the thin hull. The refugees screamed in terror as the fishermen began to leap onto their boat, wielding hammers and knives. They were not there to rescue anyone. They were there to harvest everything of value. The pirates moved with an organized ferocity that suggested they had done this many times before. They ignored the cries for mercy and began to tear the clothes off the men and women, looking for hidden gold or money. Anyone who resisted was met with a swift and brutal blow. The second tongue of the breaking point occurred when the pirates began to grab the men by their hair and throw them overboard into the churning wake of the trawler, leaving them to drown in the deep. Lan clutched her daughter and moved to the very back of the boat, trying to hide behind a stack of old fishing nets. She watched in horror as her friends and neighbors were beaten and robbed. The air was filled with the sounds of splashing water and the guttural shouts of the pirates. They were efficient and cold, stripped of any human empathy. They were maritime predators who had found an easy kill, and they were going to make sure that nothing of value was left behind. The third tongue of the dark spiral was the most devastating. Once the pirates had taken all the gold and killed the men who could pose a threat, they turned their attention to the women. They dragged Lan and several others onto the deck of the trawler, ignoring their pleas to be left with their children. The small refugee boat, now half submerged and filled with the dead and the dying, was cut loose and left to drift away into the darkening shadows of the late afternoon. The survivors who were later found by the Red Cross provided accounts that were almost too graphic to record in official documents. They spoke of a place called Kra Island, a tiny speck of land where the pirates took the women they chose to keep. Forensic teams later found shallow graves and remnants of clothing scattered among the rocks. The logs of the Thai patrol boats eventually confirmed that thousands of refugees were missing from the official arrival tallies. The aftermath for Nguyen Thi Lan and the others was a long road of trauma and silence. Those who survived the camps on Kra Island were eventually rescued by international authorities, but the scars they carried were permanent. Many of them never spoke of what happened during those weeks on the island, choosing to bury the memories deep within the quiet of their new lives. The pirates, for the most part, simply blended back into the coastal villages of the mainland. Looking out over the vast and still indifferent turquoise waters in 2026, the events in the Gulf of Thailand are remembered as one of the great human rights catastrophes of the post-war era. While the Thai government eventually increased patrols and reduced the number of attacks, the sheer scale of the lives lost to piracy remains unknown. There are no monuments on Kra Island, only the wind and the waves that continue to wash over the sand. The ocean has a way of hiding the evidence of the things that humans do to one another. Most of the men who operated those trawlers in 1981 are now elderly, living out their days in peace, their crimes forgotten by the world. They were never brought to trial, and the gold they stole has long since been spent. The families of the victims still wait for answers that will never come, looking out at the turquoise water and wondering where their loved ones' final moments took place. The beauty of the Gulf is a mask for the horror that lies beneath. The ocean is vast enough to swallow 1,000 screams, and silent enough to keep them forever. We have seen the darkness that hides in a quiet apartment and the cruelty that waits in the middle of a vast ocean. But sometimes, the most terrifying thing of all is not a person or a predator, but the very walls that are supposed to keep us safe. We are moving from the lawless waters of the east to a crowded city in the west, where a night of music and dancing was about to be turned into a nightmare by a few heavy iron chains and a single spark of fire in the dark. On a freezing morning in January 1981, a 24-year-old activist named Mazlum Dogan was marched through the iron gates of Diyarbakir military prison in southeastern Turkey. The walls were thick and gray, rising up like a tomb against the winter sky. He could hear the heavy boots of the guards crunching on the frozen dirt, a sound that would soon become the rhythm of his life. Everything was silent except for the whistling of the cold wind. The air inside the entrance hall was stale and carried the scent of old cigarettes and damp concrete. Mazlum was stripped of his belongings and his civilian clothes, replaced by a thin uniform that offered no protection against the chill. He was not just a prisoner, he was a symbol of a movement that the new military government wanted to crush. As the heavy steel doors slid shut behind him, the sound echoed through the hallway like a final heartbeat. Turkey in 1981 was a nation under a shadow, having just experienced a brutal military coup that changed the rules of existence overnight. Thousands of people like Mazlum, who dreamed of social change and cultural identity, were being swept off the streets and into a network of high-security prisons. Diyarbakir Prison No. 5 was the most notorious of them all, a place designed not for rehabilitation, but for the total destruction of the soul. Mazlum Dogan was an intellectual, a man who found strength in books and the power of the written word. Before his arrest, he spent his days in small tea houses, discussing the future of his people and the importance of preserving their heritage. He believed that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could not be silenced as long as people remembered their roots. His idealism was his greatest asset, but in Diyarbakir, it would become his greatest burden. The conditions inside the cell blocks were intentionally designed to strip away every shred of human dignity. 10 men were often packed into a space built for 2, sleeping on cold stone floors with nothing but a single thin blanket to share between them. The food was little more than watered-down soup with bits of stone and dirt mixed in. Despite the physical hunger, Mazlum and his comrades found ways to keep their minds sharp by whispering stories to one another. In those quiet moments between the guards' rounds, they would share memories of the mountains and the smell of fresh bread from their mothers' kitchens. They created a secret language of taps on the walls, a rhythmic code that allowed them to check on the welfare of prisoners in other wings. This bond of brotherhood was the only thing that kept the creeping despair at bay. They were a community of ghosts, waiting for a dawn that seemed more distant with every day. What most people do not realize is that the military government did not just want information. They wanted a total psychological surrender. They believed that if they could break the leaders of the movement inside these walls, the resistance outside would wither and die. Mazlum was a primary target because of his influence and his refusal to bow his head. He was subjected to hours of interrogation under blinding lights, where the silence was often more painful than the noise. And this is the part that he had absolutely no way of knowing as he sat in his cell, trying to memorize the cracks in the ceiling. He did not know that the commandant of the prison, a man named Esat Oktay Yildiran, was about to implement a new system of humiliation that would involve a German shepherd. He thought he had already seen the worst of what men could do to one another, but the true nightmare was only beginning to stretch its long and dark limbs. If you were standing in that hallway, the silence would press against your eardrums like two hands slowly squeezing. You would hear the distant clinking of keys and the low, guttural growl of an animal that sounded more like a machine than a living thing. The guards moved with a robotic precision, their faces hidden behind masks of indifference. The atmosphere was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the sour tang of sweat that never quite washed away. The shift in the prison's energy happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the cell doors were suddenly thrown open. Instead of the usual call for exercise, the prisoners were ordered to line up in the corridor and face the wall. A tall officer with a thick mustache walked past them, trailing a large, well-groomed dog on a heavy leather leash. The officer spoke in a calm, almost polite voice, explaining that from now on the dog would be their superior commander. The self-deception that Muslim had used to survive began to fracture. He told himself that this was just another mind game, a temporary tactic to see who would crack first. He believed that if he just remained calm and followed the basic rules, the officers would eventually tire of the spectacle. He did not want to believe that he was in a place where logic had been replaced by a cruel and twisted theater. He clung to his books and his memories like a drowning man. The first tongue of the dark spiral began when the prisoners were forced to salute the dog, which was named Joe, as if it were a high-ranking general. They had to stand at attention and recite military anthems to the animal, while the guards watched for any sign of hesitation. If a prisoner refused or showed any hint of a smile, they were taken to a room at the end of the hall. The sounds that came from that room were enough to turn the strongest man's blood into ice. The escalation continued into the second tongue of breaking point, as the psychological torture became a constant 24-hour cycle. The prisoners were forbidden from speaking their native language, even in their sleep. They were forced to eat their meals while sitting in filth, while the dog Joe was fed fresh meat right in front of them. The goal was to make the men feel lower than an animal, to strip away the very core of their identity until nothing was left. The third tongue of the nightmare reached its peak in the spring of 1982, during the time of the Newroz festival. Muslim Dogan realized that the system was designed to keep them in a state of perpetual fear until they either died or betrayed their friends. He decided that the only way to break the cycle was to commit an act of defiance that the guards could not ignore. He took 3 matches and used them to start a fire that would become his final protest. The detail that haunts me most about this story is the absolute stillness of Muslim in his final moments. He didn't scream or beg for help. He simply stood his ground as the flames rose up around him. He wanted his death to be a signal to the other prisoners that their spirits were still their own. When the guards finally broke into the cell, they found the matches and a man who had chosen to leave the world on his own terms rather than live under the leash of a dog. The aftermath of the Diyarbakir atrocities led to a massive wave of radicalization that would haunt the region for the next 4 decades. The survivors who were eventually released spoke of the horrors they witnessed, turning the prison into a symbol of state-sanctioned cruelty. Forensic reports and human rights investigations later confirmed the systematic nature of the torture, including the role of the commandant and his dog in the psychological destruction of the men. The offender profile for Esat Oktay Yildiran is a study in the banality of evil. He was a man who believed he was doing his duty for the state, using fear as a tool of governance. In 1988, years after he left Diyarbakir, he was assassinated on a public bus in Istanbul by people who had never forgotten his crimes. His death was a reminder that the shadows of the past eventually catch up to those who think they are untouchable behind a uniform. Now that the iron gates of that tomb stand open as a museum in 2026, the Turkish government has officially closed prison number 5 and began the process of turning it into a museum of shame. The thick gray walls are now being preserved so that future generations can see the cells where Muslim and his comrades suffered. The dog Joe has long since passed away, but the memory of the salute still lingers in the minds of those who made it out alive. The ghosts of Diyarbakir are finally being given a voice. In that place, a dog had more humanity than the men holding its leash. The iron gates of Diyarbakir closed with a finality that seemed to erase the very sun from the sky. But while one man was fighting for his soul inside a concrete box, another tragedy was quietly brewing in the heart of Central America. We are shifting from the frozen cells of Turkey to the humid, sun-drenched streets of Guatemala, where the smoke of a peaceful protest was about to be replaced by the blinding heat of an embassy in flames. On the bright morning of January 31st, 1980, a humble farmer named Vicente Menchu walked into the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City alongside a group of unarmed protesters to plead for their lives. The embassy was a beautiful old building with white walls and polished wooden floors, standing as a quiet sanctuary in a city that was slowly being consumed by a brutal civil war. Vicente felt the weight of his entire community resting on his tired shoulders as he entered. He was joined by 35 other people, mostly indigenous peasants from the Quiche region, who had seen their homes burned and their families murdered by the military. They carried no weapons, only a desperate need to be heard by the world outside their borders. As they were greeted by the Spanish ambassador, Maximo Cajal, there was a brief moment where the air felt lighter, as if the thick walls of the embassy could actually keep the darkness of the world at bay. Vicente Menchu was a man of the earth, someone who had spent his entire life working the cornfields under the hot Guatemalan sun. His hands were thick and calloused, stained by the soil that he loved so much. He was a leader in his village, a man who spoke with a quiet authority that came from a deep sense of justice. He was not a politician or a soldier. He was simply a father who wanted his children to grow up in a world where they did not have to hide in the woods. The journey from the highlands to the capital had been long and dangerous, involving miles of walking through mountain passes to avoid the military checkpoints. Vicente and his companions had survived on nothing but dried corn and hope, sleeping under the stars and praying that they would not be caught before they reached their destination. They believed that if they could just speak to a foreign diplomat, the government would be forced to stop the massacres in the countryside. Inside the embassy, the group was treated with a kindness that they had not experienced in years. Ambassador Cajal offered them chairs and listened intently as Vicente described the horrors that were happening in the Quiche region. The room smelled of expensive coffee and old books, a stark contrast to the smell of wood smoke and damp earth that Vicente was used to. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a human being rather than a target for a death squad. They spent the morning explaining their situation, showing the ambassador the documents they had brought to prove the military's crimes. Vicente spoke of the soldiers who had come to his village in the middle of the night, and of the way the sky turned orange as their houses were set on fire. He spoke for the thousands of people who were too afraid to speak for themselves, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him in the quiet room. What most people do not realize is that the Spanish embassy was considered sovereign soil, a place where the Guatemalan police were legally forbidden from entering without permission. The protesters believed this international law would be their shield, a thin but unbreakable barrier between them and the guns of the regime. They thought that by occupying a diplomatic building, they were forcing a peaceful negotiation that would eventually lead to a lasting and fair peace. And this is the part that Vicente had absolutely no way of knowing as he sat in that comfortable chair. He did not know that the Guatemalan government had already decided that there would be no negotiations and no peace. He did not know that the police had been ordered to retake the building by any means necessary, regardless of the lives inside. He thought he was in a sanctuary, but he was actually sitting in a trap that had been designed by men with no mercy. If you were standing on the street outside that morning, you would have seen a ring of steel slowly tightening around the white building. Hundreds of police officers in full riot gear were taking up positions, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They were not carrying bullhorns to talk. They were carrying heavy tools to break down the doors and containers of flammable liquid. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and the low hum of the police radios. The shift in energy inside the embassy was sudden and terrifying. One moment, the protesters were discussing their next steps, and the next, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the hallways. Vicente looked out the window and saw the police storming the gates, ignoring the shouts of the ambassador to stop. The peaceful atmosphere was instantly replaced by a wave of pure, unadulated panic as the group realized that their sanctuary had been breached. Vicente moved to the center of the room, gathering his friends together and telling them to stay calm and keep their hands visible. He believed that if they showed they were peaceful, the police would not open fire. But the police were not looking for a peaceful resolution. They began to pour gasoline through the broken windows and into the entrance hall, the sharp chemical scent filling the air and making it difficult for anyone inside the embassy to take a breath. The self-deception that had kept Vicente going for weeks finally collapsed. He told himself that the police were just trying to scare them, that they would never actually set fire to a diplomatic building. He believed that the presence of the Spanish ambassador would protect them from the ultimate act of violence. He wanted so badly to believe in the rules of the world, even as he saw the police officers reaching for their lighters and their heavy military flamethrowers. The first tongue of the dark spiral began when a single spark ignited the gasoline, sending a wall of fire racing through the lower floor of the embassy. The heat was instantaneous and overwhelming, melting the plastic light fixtures and turning the air into a searing mist. Protesters tried to scramble toward the upper floors, but the fire moved faster than they could run. The sound of the flames was like a high-speed train roaring through a narrow and crowded tunnel. The second tongue of the breaking point was the discovery that the police had blocked all the exits from the outside. People were throwing themselves against the heavy doors, their fingers clawing at the wood as the smoke became so thick that they could no longer see their own hands. They were trapped in a cage of fire, listening to the police shouting orders outside while the skin on their faces began to blister. The screams for help were drowned out by the roar of the inferno. Inside the ambassador's office, Vicente and several others were huddled together as the ceiling began to collapse. The smoke was a solid wall of black that tasted of chemicals and death. The third tongue of the nightmare was the absolute realization that no one was coming to save them. The police stood by and watched as the building burned, even turning away the fire trucks that tried to reach the scene. It was a cold and calculated act of state-sanctioned mass murder. The forensic reports that were released years later provided a graphic account of the final moments inside the embassy. 30 Sao people were incinerated, including Vicente Menchu and several members of the Spanish diplomatic staff. The bodies were found in piles near the windows, where they had tried in vain to escape the heat. Only 2 people managed to survive the initial fire, including the ambassador and a single peasant who had hidden under a desk in a corner. The aftermath of the burning of the Spanish embassy led to an immediate break in diplomatic ties between Spain and Guatemala. The international community was horrified by the blatant violation of sovereign soil and the sheer brutality of the attack. For Vicente Mencha's family, the pain was only beginning. His daughter, Rigoberta, would eventually win the Nobel Peace Prize for telling the world the story of what happened that day and for her work for indigenous rights. The offender profile for the Guatemalan police commanders involved in the raid shows a complete lack of accountability. They claimed that the protesters had set the fire themselves, a lie that was debunked by every witness and forensic expert at the scene. The government refused to apologize or even investigate the incident for decades, protecting the men who had ordered the massacre as if they were heroes of the state rather than common and brutal criminals. The lone survivor among the peasants, a man named Gregorio Ugasona, was taken to a hospital with severe burns. But the nightmare did not end there. In the middle of the night, he was kidnapped from his hospital bed by a death squad and executed, his body dumped on the grounds of a university the following day. It was a final message from the regime that there would be no witnesses to the truth. The state wanted to ensure that the story died with the fire. Even as the sun rises over the modern streets of Guatemala City in 2026, the site of the old embassy is a place of quiet reflection for the people of Guatemala. A small plaque commemorates those who died, but the deep scars on the national psyche remain. The fire at the embassy is seen as a turning point in the Civil War, a moment when the regime showed that it was willing to burn down the entire world just to maintain its grip on power. The ashes of that day still haunt the streets of the capital city. They went looking for a voice, but all they left behind was ash. The flames of the embassy left a scar on the land that could never be erased, turning a place of peace into a tomb of smoke and shadow. But while the fire in Guatemala was an act of public violence, other people were disappearing into the darkness without a sound or a trace. We are moving from the blinding light of an inferno to the chilling silence of a busy street corner, where a young man was about to become the first ghost of a new and terrifying era. The smoke from the embassy eventually cleared, leaving behind nothing but the cold taste of charcoal and regret in the air. But in the neighboring country of Honduras, a different kind of darkness was spreading through the streets of the capital. It was a silence that felt heavier than any explosion or scream. We are moving from the loud violence of a fire to the quiet terror of a man who was there 1 second and then simply erased from the world as if he never existed. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, September 12, 1981, a 23-year-old student named Manfredo Velasquez was walking down a busy street in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, when two unmarked cars pulled up beside him. The sun was shining on the pavement, and the street was filled with the sounds of traffic and people going about their daily lives. He was just a few blocks from the university where he was studying to become a teacher for his own people. The cars were nondescript and dusty, blending in perfectly with the thousands of other vehicles that moved through the city every day. They stopped with a precision that suggested the drivers had been following Manfredo's every move for weeks. There were no sirens and no official markings to indicate that this was a legal arrest. It was a moment of terrifying stillness in the middle of a crowded city where the normal rules of the world had suddenly ceased to apply. Manfredo Velasquez was more than just a name on a student registry. He was a young man with a deep soul and a passion for helping others. He had grown up in a small town where everyone knew his name, and his family was respected for their kindness and their commitment to education. He was the first in his family to attend the National University, and he carried the hopes of his entire community on his shoulders. He believed that he could truly make a difference. In 1981, Honduras was a country caught in the crossfire of the Cold War, and the military government was deeply suspicious of anyone who spoke out for social change. Manfredo knew the risks, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He spent his evenings at the university library reading books on philosophy and international law. He wanted to use the power of the mind rather than the power of the gun to bring justice to the people he loved. His personal life was filled with the same kind of hope and joy that he brought to his activism. He was recently engaged to a young woman named Zenaida, and they were already planning their wedding for the following spring. They spent their weekends walking through the parks of Tegucigalpa, dreaming of the house they would build and the children they would raise together. For Manfredo, the future was a bright and beautiful landscape that was full of promise. He was a devoted son who visited his mother every Sunday, bringing her small gifts and telling her stories about his life in the city. She would worry about him as mothers do, but he would always kiss her on the cheek and tell her that he was doing the right thing. He believed that his work was a form of service to his country, and that his family would one day be proud of the legacy he left behind. He was a man who lived his life with a deep sense of purpose. On the morning of his disappearance, Manfredo had woken up early to finish a paper for one of his classes. He had spent the morning in a small cafe near the university, sipping coffee and chatting with his fellow students about their upcoming exams. The air was warm, and the smell of roasting beans and fresh bread filled the room. It was a perfectly normal morning, in a city that felt like it was finally moving toward a more modern and peaceful future. He had met Zenaida for a quick lunch at a local market where they sat on small wooden stools and shared a plate of traditional food. They talked about the flowers she wanted for the wedding and the music they would play at the reception. Manfredo had held her hand across the table, feeling the warmth of her skin and the weight of the engagement ring he had worked so hard to buy. He was a man who was deeply in love and completely at peace with his life. As they walked out of the market, Manfredo had promised to call her that evening to finalize the guest list. He watched her walk away until she disappeared into the crowd, feeling a sense of gratitude for the life they were building together. He had no reason to believe that this was the last time he would ever see her, or that his world was about to be shattered. He turned back toward the university, walking with a light step and a heart that was full of joy. The streets of Tegucigalpa were crowded with shoppers and office workers, all moving with a sense of urgency. Manfredo enjoyed the energy of the city, the sounds of the vendors calling out their prices, and the smell of the street food cooking on every corner. He felt a sense of belonging in this place, as if he was a part of a larger story that was unfolding in the heart of Central America. He was a young man who felt like he finally had everything he ever wanted. He stopped at a small bookstore to pick up a volume of poetry that he wanted to read to Zenaida that evening. The shopkeeper recognized him, and they spent a few minutes talking about the weather and the latest news from the countryside. Manfredo walked out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling a sense of quiet contentment. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do. He felt like the entire world was laid out in front of him. And this is the part that he had absolutely no way of knowing as he stepped off the curb to cross the street toward the university gates. He did not know that his name had been added to a secret list of targets by a military unit that operated outside the law. He did not know that the dust-covered cars at the end of the block were waiting for him to reach the perfect spot where the crowd would be too thin to intervene. He was walking into a trap of silence. To Manfredo, the world was a place of rules and consequences, where a man was safe as long as he stayed true to his principles. He believed that the state existed to protect its citizens, and that the law was a sacred boundary that no one would dare to cross in broad daylight. He had no way of knowing that for the men in those unmarked cars, the law was nothing more than a suggestion, and that his life was a price they were more than willing to pay for their order. He was thinking about the paper he had written and the life he was planning with Zenaida as he reached the center of the block. The university gates were only 100 yards away, and he could see his friends standing on the steps, laughing and talking. He felt a sense of pride in his community and his future as a teacher. He was a young man who was completely unaware that his existence was about to be officially erased by the very state he hoped to serve. The sun was hot on his back, and the air was filled with the sounds of a city that was alive and vibrant. He had every reason to believe that he would be sitting in his classroom in an hour and talking to Zenaida on the phone by sunset. But the path in front of him was about to be cut short by a darkness that left no footprint. He was a student, a lover, and a son who was about to become a ghost in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in 1981. The first sign that something was wrong was the sudden change in the rhythm of the traffic around him. The two unmarked cars accelerated with a high-pitched whine of their engines swerving across the lane to block the sidewalk. Manfredo stopped and blinked as the doors flew open, and several men in plain clothes stepped out with their hands on their waistbands. The air suddenly felt thick and heavy, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the street by a giant lung. He looked around for help, but he saw the people on the sidewalk looking down or turning their heads away, as if they had suddenly found something fascinating on the ground. The indifference of the crowd was a cold and sharp realization that pierced through his confusion. He felt a sudden drop in the temperature around him, as if a shadow had fallen over the entire street. The sounds of the city seemed to fade away into a low and rhythmic humming in his own ears. The self-deception that had protected his mind for years finally broke as the men grabbed him by his arms. He told himself that they were just police officers who had made a mistake, and that if he just went with them and explained who he was, they would let him go. He believed that the truth would be his shield, even as he was being shoved into the back of the car. He wanted to believe that he was just going to the station to answer a few simple questions. The first tongue of the nightmare began as the car sped away from the university, leaving behind only a small cloud of exhaust and a stunned silence on the street. Manfredo was blindfolded with a rough piece of cloth, and his hands were tied behind his back with heavy plastic zip ties that bit into his skin. He could hear the men talking in low voices, but they ignored his questions and his pleas for information. He was no longer a person. He was a package. The car drove for what felt like hours, moving from the smooth pavement of the city to the bumpy dirt roads of the outskirts. Manfredo could feel every jolt in the suspension as the reality of his situation began to sink in with a crushing weight. He realized that he was being taken to a place where the light of the sun and the rules of the world did not reach. He was being moved into the secret infrastructure of a state that had decided to become a killer. The second tongue of the breaking point was the sound of a heavy metal gate opening and the smell of damp concrete and old blood that filled the air. Manfredo was dragged out of the car and into a building that felt like a cold and hollow tomb. He could hear the sounds of other people crying and the rhythmic thumping of heavy boots on the floor above him. He was taken to a small room that had no windows and only a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The men who questioned him were members of Battalion 316, a secret unit that had been trained in the dark arts of interrogation and disappearance. They did not care about his papers or his classes. They only wanted to know the names of his friends and the details of his student meetings. When he refused to speak, they used techniques that were designed to break the mind as well as the body. He was entering a cycle of pain that had no schedule and no end. I have covered a lot of dark stories, but the detail that haunts me most about Manfredo's case is the absolute isolation of his final days. He was in the heart of his own country, surrounded by people who spoke his language, but he was as far away from help as if he were on the surface of the moon. It makes you realize how easily a person can be erased when the very people who are supposed to protect them are the ones who are holding the keys to their secret cell. The interrogation sessions lasted for days, blurring the line between waking and sleeping until Manfredo lost all sense of time. He was kept in a state of perpetual fear, never knowing when the door would open or what new form of cruelty the men would bring with them. He thought about Zenaida and his mother using their faces as a way to hold on to his sanity in the darkness. He tried to remember the poetry he had bought, but the words were starting to slip away. The third tongue of the dark spiral was the realization that he was never intended to leave the building alive. The men in Battalion 316 did not take prisoners, they took targets. Once they were finished with their interrogation, they moved their victims to a secondary location that was even more secret than the first. Manfredo was taken in the middle of the night to a remote area where the only sound was the wind in the trees and the digging of a shovel. The evidence of what happened to him was later reconstructed from the testimonies of former members of the unit who decided to speak out years later. They described a system of state-sanctioned murder that was as efficient as it was brutal. They spoke of the secret cemeteries and the unmarked graves that were scattered throughout the countryside of Honduras. They confirmed that Manfredo Velázquez was one of the many names that had been permanently erased. The military records from that era were either destroyed or hidden away in dusty archives that remained closed to the public for decades. But the silence of the state was not enough to keep the truth from surfacing eventually. The investigation into Battalion 316 revealed a network of state crime that reached into the highest levels of the government. It was a story of a nation that had turned on its own children to preserve a power that was built on fear. Manfredo's disappearance became a turning point for the human rights movement in Central America. His family refused to accept the official lies, and they began a legal battle that would eventually reach the highest courts in the world. They were not just fighting for their son. They were fighting for the thousands of others who had been taken in the night. Their courage was a small but steady flame in a darkness that seemed to have no end or any sign of mercy. The detail of the CIA involvement in the training of the unit added a layer of international intrigue to the case. It was revealed that the secret detention centers were part of a larger strategy to eliminate political dissidents during the regional crisis. The training manuals and the funding for the battalion were linked to a foreign power that was more concerned with the Cold War than with the lives of the students in Tegucigalpa. It was a tragedy of global scale. In the final moments of his life, Manfredo was alone with his thoughts and the memories of the people he loved. He had gone from a bright afternoon on a busy street to a nameless grave in a forest he did not recognize. He had lived his life with a deep sense of justice, and he died because of it. The student who wanted to be a teacher had become a lesson for the entire world about the fragility of freedom and the dark capacity of a state to devour its own. The aftermath of the disappearance led to the first ever conviction of a state by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In a landmark ruling, the court found the government of Honduras responsible for the forced disappearance of Manfredo Velázquez. It was a historic victory for justice, but it did not bring Manfredo back to his family or to the woman who was waiting for him. The legal victory was a cold comfort for a mother who still looked for her son in every crowd. The offender profile for the members of Battalion 316 is a record of men who believed they were above the law. Many of them were never brought to justice for their specific roles in the disappearances, and they lived out their lives in the comfort of their homes. Some of them even continued to hold positions of power in the government for years after the military rule had ended. Their names are recorded in human rights reports, but their faces are forgotten. The search for a man who became a ghost continues today in the silence. Manfredo Velázquez has never been found. The search for his remains continues in the quiet corners of the Honduran countryside, but the earth refuses to give up its secrets. His family still holds a memorial for him every September 12th, lighting a candle and placing his photograph on the mantle. The university student who disappeared 45 years ago is now a symbol of a generation that was lost to a war that was never officially declared. The state didn't just take his life, they took his very existence. The disappearance of Manfredo left a hollow space in the heart of Tegucigalpa, a silence that could never be filled by legal rulings or public apologies. But while one man was being erased from the map of Honduras, another tragedy was being written in the dust of a village in El Salvador. We are moving from the quiet terror of a secret cell to the loud and brutal destruction of an entire community, where the only thing left behind was a chorus of ghosts in the trees. On the morning of December 11th, 1981, a 38-year-old mother named Rufina Amaya stood inside her small clay house in the village of El Mozote, El Salvador, as the sun began to warm the red dust of the street. Outside, she was preparing breakfast for her 4 young children while her husband finished his morning chores in the yard. The air smelled of wood smoke and toasted corn tortillas, a scent that usually meant a day of hard work and family. The village of El Mozote was tucked away in the mountains of the Morazan department, a place where the sound of the wind through the pines was often the only noise you could hear. It was a peaceful community of farmers and small shopkeepers who had intentionally stayed out of the civil war that was tearing the rest of the country apart. They believed that because they were neutral, they were safe from the violence that was spreading like a dark stain across the map. Rufina Amaya was a woman whose life was built around the rhythms of the earth and the needs of her growing family. She was known in the village for her strength and her kindness, always willing to share what little she had with a neighbor in need. Her children were the center of her world, and she spent her days teaching them the old songs and the importance of working with their hands. To Rufina, her home was a fortress of love in a very uncertain time. The town was small and intimate, where everyone knew the names of each other's children and the history of every family tree. On that particular Friday, the market was starting to buzz with activity as people traded their produce and shared the latest news from the nearby towns. There was a sense of shared resilience among the villagers, a belief that as long as they had their land and their community, they could survive anything the world threw at them that year. Rufina watched her oldest son help his father with the firewood, feeling a deep sense of pride in the young man he was becoming. She imagined him one day having a farm of his own and raising his own family in the same quiet hills where she had grown up. The future was something she viewed with a quiet optimism despite the rumors of military movements in the distant valleys. She believed that the war was something that happened to other people in other places. The Atlacatl battalion had arrived in the area just a day before, but they had told the villagers that they were only looking for rebels. The soldiers were dressed in clean uniforms and carried modern weapons provided by the United States government. Many of the families in El Mozote had even sold food and supplies to the troops, thinking that being helpful would ensure their protection. It was a relationship based on a desperate need for peace in a time of conflict. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the village square where the children were playing a game with a handful of stones. The sound of their laughter was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the mountains that surrounded them. Rufina finished her work and sat on the porch for a moment of rest, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face. It was a moment of absolute normalcy in a world that was about to disappear. She watched her youngest daughter sleep in a small wooden cradle, her chest rising and falling in a slow and steady rhythm. Rufina felt a wave of protective love for the child, promising her that she would always be there to keep her safe from the world. She thought about the Christmas celebration they were planning for the following week, and the small gifts she had been saving for months. The holiday was going to be a time of joy and renewal for the entire village. The villagers of El Mozote had even gathered in the local church the night before to pray for the safety of their families and the end of the war. They felt that their faith would be a shield against any harm and that their innocence was a matter of public record. They were people who believed in the power of prayer and the basic goodness of their fellow men. This belief was the foundation of their community and the source of their strength during the difficult years. Rufina's husband came into the kitchen and sat beside her, taking her hand in his and giving it a gentle squeeze. They didn't need words to express the deep connection they shared or the plans they had for the years ahead. They were a team working together to build a life for their children in a land that they loved with all their hearts. They felt like they had finally reached a point of stability and security after years of hard work and careful saving that winter. The village was surrounded by lush green forests and clear mountain streams, providing a sense of natural isolation that felt like a sanctuary. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth that Rufina associated with home. She felt a deep sense of belonging in this place, as if she were a part of the landscape itself. She had no desire to ever leave these hills, or the people who made them feel like the safest place on the planet Earth. In the quiet of the morning, Rufina could hear the distant lowing of the cattle and the rhythmic sound of a neighbor's loom. These were the sounds of a life well lived, a life that was built on the values of hard work and family and community. She felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything she had, even if it wasn't much by the standards of the city. She was a woman who was completely at peace with her place in the world and her future in the village. What most people do not realize is that El Mozote was actually a very religious town that had been warned by the guerrillas to stay away, but the villagers refused to leave their homes. They believed that their neutral stance and their faith in God would protect them from any military action. They thought that because they were not fighting, they were not targets. This innocence was their most beautiful quality, but in the eyes of the battalion, it was an opportunity. And this is the part that Rufina had absolutely no way of knowing as she watched her children play in the yard. She did not know that the soldiers she had fed the night before were currently being told that everyone in the village was a collaborator who needed to be eliminated. She did not know that the very neutrality she relied on was seen by the military as a sign of hidden support for the enemy. She was living in a world of hope while the army was planning. The shift in the energy of the village began when the soldiers started to round everyone up and move them toward the central plaza with a new and aggressive intensity. The polite smiles of the previous evening were gone, replaced by cold stares and the sharp bark of military commands. The air suddenly felt heavy and still, as if the mountain itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. Rufina felt a cold chill run down her spine as she held her children close. The smell of gun oil and diesel fumes began to overwhelm the scent of the pine trees and the morning tortillas. The soldiers moved with a mechanical precision, their boots making a heavy rhythmic sound on the packed dirt of the street. Rufina saw the fear in the eyes of her neighbors, but she told herself it was just a standard inspection that would be over soon. She wanted to believe that if they just cooperated, the soldiers would eventually leave them alone. The self-deception that had protected her mind began to fracture as the soldiers started to separate the men from the women and the children. Rufina clutched her husband's hand, but a soldier pushed her back with the butt of his rifle. She told herself that they were just going to question the men separately and that they would be reunited within the hour. She believed that the rules of war would protect the innocent families, even as she saw the dark bayonets. The first tongue of the nightmare began when the soldiers led the men away to the outskirts of the village in small groups. Rufina was forced into a small house with dozens of other women and children, where the air was thick with the sound of crying and the smell of fear. She could hear the muffled sound of machine gun fire from the woods, followed by a terrifying silence that seemed to last forever. She realized that the men were never coming back to them in this life. The escalation continued into the second tongue of breaking point as the soldiers returned to the houses to take the older women and the young girls. Rufina watched as her neighbors were dragged away, their screams echoing through the empty streets of the village. She hid in a dark corner of the room, trying to keep her children quiet while the soldiers systematically moved from house to house. The world she knew was being dismantled, one scream and one life at a time. The third tongue of the dark spiral was the most horrific of all, when the soldiers turned their attention to the children who had been left behind. Rufina saw them being led toward the small parish house next to the church, their voices high and thin as they called out for their mothers. She managed to slip out of a back window and hide in a thicket of thorns behind the building, listening in frozen terror to the sounds that no human should ever have to hear in the dark. If you were standing in those bushes with Rufina, you would have felt the cold ground against your stomach and the sharp thorns tearing at your skin. You would have heard the rhythmic sound of the gunfire and the heavy thud of bodies falling against the wooden floors of the parish house. The air was filled with the smell of smoke and iron as the soldiers began to set the buildings on fire to hide the evidence of what they had done in the name of the state army. I have covered many dark stories in my life, but the detail that haunts me most about El Mozote is the way the soldiers joked as they carried out their orders. They were not men possessed by a temporary madness. They were trained killers who were following a specific plan to erase a village from the map. It makes you realize that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not a gun or a bomb, but the absolute certainty that your victims are no longer human beings. Rufina lay in the dirt for hours, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would crack her ribs. She watched as the flames consumed her home and the homes of everyone she had ever known. She saw the soldiers marching away in the twilight, their uniforms stained with the red dust and the blood of the people who had fed them the night before. She was the only one left in a village of ghosts, the only witness to a crime that the world would deny for 40 long years. The forensic excavations that were conducted in the early 1990s provided a graphic and undeniable account of the scale of the horror at El Mozote. The investigators found the remains of over 800 people, and more than half of them were children under the age of 12. In the small parish house, they found hundreds of tiny skeletons huddled together in the corners where they had sought safety. The evidence was as clear as it was devastating. The reports from the forensic teams described the way the bullets had been fired at close range and the way the buildings had been collapsed onto the victims. They found toys and small shoes among the bones, a heartbreaking reminder of the lives that had been cut short in a single afternoon. The military records showed that the Atlacatl Battalion had been at the scene, but the official story from the government remained a total denial of any mass killing in the hills. For years, both the Salvadoran and the United States governments claimed that the reports of the massacre were nothing more than communist propaganda designed to discredit the military. They ignored the testimonies of the survivors and the evidence of the graves, choosing instead to protect the geopolitical interests of the Cold War. It was a secondary crime of silence that was almost as cruel as the bullets that had been fired in the mountains of El Salvador. The detail of the tiny skeletons found in the parish house became the defining image of the El Mozote massacre for the rest of the world. It was a physical proof that could not be ignored or explained away by political rhetoric. The bones told a story of a vulnerability that had been exploited and an innocence that had been murdered in cold blood. The silence of the graves was finally broken by the voices of the scientists who refused to look the other way in 1992. The surrogate commentary I can offer here is that El Mozote represents the absolute failure of our collective humanity to protect those who have no voice. We often talk about the rules of war as if they are a shield, but in reality, they are only as strong as the men who choose to follow them. When we allow ideology to trump empathy, we create the conditions for a nightmare like this to occur. It is a reminder that the cost of silence is always paid in human blood. The aftermath of the El Mozote massacre led to a historic case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which found the state of El Salvador responsible for the mass murder. The government was forced to apologize and to begin the process of providing reparations to the survivors and the families of the victims. It was a victory for the truth, but it did not bring back the hundreds of lives that had been lost in the red dust of the mountain village that winter. The offender profile for the commanders of the Atlacatl Battalion shows a group of men who were trained at the School of the Americas and who operated with a sense of total impunity. Many of them lived out their lives in comfort and positions of power long after the war had ended. They claimed that they were only doing what was necessary to save the country from communism. Their lack of remorse is a chilling testament to the power of a dark and twisted ideology. In the bustling and vibrant streets of modern Nairobi in 2026, the scars are hidden. The legal proceedings against the surviving military officers are still ongoing in the courts of El Salvador. The case has been delayed many times by political pressure and legal maneuvers, but the families of the victims refuse to give up. They continue to gather at the site of the massacre every December 11th to light candles and to read the names of the dead. The village of El Mozote has become a sacred ground for justice in the region. Rufina Amaya passed away in 2007, but her legacy continues to inspire those who fight for human rights in Central America and beyond. She lived her life with a dignity that the soldiers could never take from her, and she died knowing that the world finally knew the truth about what happened in her village. The mountain air of Morazan still carries the scent of the pine trees, but it also carries the memory of the children of El Mozote and their mothers. The only thing louder than the gunshots that day was the silence that followed for 40 years. The silence of El Mozote was a heavy and suffocating thing, a weight that stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives in the mountains. But while the mountain air of El Salvador was thick with the scent of wood smoke and ash, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding across the ocean in the heart of East Africa. We are moving from the red dust of Central America to the dry plains of Uganda, where a group of people sought safety under a different symbol of peace. On the morning of June 24, 1981, a 35-year-old teacher named Samuel Atiku led his family toward the white walls of the Mbachai Catholic Mission in the West Nile region of Uganda. The sun was a pale eye in the sky, and the air was thick with the scent of dry grass. He believed the red cross on the roof would be their shield against the madness of the war that was now at their door. Samuel gripped the hands of his small children as they walked through the tall grass, keeping their heads low as the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the plains. They were among thousands of civilians who were fleeing the scorched earth campaign of the National Army. To Samuel, the mission was not just a building, it was a sacred boundary that even the most brutal soldiers would surely respect in a country losing its very soul. Before the war, Samuel had been a man who found great joy in the simple act of teaching young minds in his village classroom. He was a master of history and language, and he believed that education was the only true path to a peaceful and prosperous Uganda. He spent his evenings reading by candlelight and discussing the future of the nation with his neighbors. He was a man of logic who looked for the best in every person he met. His wife was a gentle woman who managed their small farm with a grace that Samuel admired every single day. They had built a life together that was rooted in the red soil of the West Nile, and their children were the pride of the entire community. They spent their weekends visiting relatives and sharing meals under the shade of the mango trees. To Samuel, the world was a place of hard work, and he had spent his life building a legacy. The West Nile region was a place of rolling hills and vast plains where the horizon seemed to stretch on forever into the distance. It was the ancestral home of former leaders, and for that reason it had become a target for the new regime in the capital. Samuel knew the political risks, but he refused to leave his land until the fire was literally at his doorstep. He believed that his status as a teacher and a man of peace would offer safety. When the soldiers finally arrived in his village, Samuel realized that the old rules of society had been completely discarded like waste. He watched as homes were set on fire and livestock was slaughtered for sport. He gathered his family and their few belongings and began the long trek toward Ombachi. He had heard that the priests there were offering food and shelter to anyone who arrived. It was the only light left in a world of dark. As they approached the gates of the mission, Samuel saw hundreds of other families who had arrived before them. The grounds were filled with makeshift tents and the sound of hushed conversations in a dozen different dialects. There was a sense of profound relief among the crowd, a shared belief that they had reached a place where the rules of God would trump the rules of the gun. Samuel found a small patch of grass for his family and slept. He spent the afternoon helping the priests organize the supplies and setting up a small school area for the children. He wanted to maintain some sense of normalcy, even in the middle of a refugee camp. He gathered a group of boys and began to tell them about the stars and the way they guided the sailors of the past. For a few hours, the sound of the war seemed to fade away into the background, replaced by the soft voices of the students. The evening meal was a quiet affair shared with a family from a neighboring district who had lost everything in a single night. They spoke of the kindness of the mission and the way the world would eventually come to their aid once the news reached the international community. Samuel believed that the Red Cross was a signal to the entire globe that there were still places of sanctuary left in Uganda. He felt a deep sense of pride. As the sun set over the plains, Samuel stood at the edge of the mission grounds and looked out toward the horizon. He saw the smoke of distant fires, but he felt a sense of distance from the danger. He believed that the walls of the mission were a sacred boundary that no soldier would dare to cross. He went back to his family and kissed his children goodnight, feeling a sense of security that he had not felt in weeks. He thought it was his harbor. His wife sat nearby, and they shared a brief moment of quiet connection as the stars began to appear in the vast sky. They spoke of the future and the things they would do once the war was finally over and they could return to their farm. Samuel felt a deep sense of love for the woman who had stood by him through everything. He was a man who believed in the power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. He felt like they found home. And this is the part that Samuel had absolutely no way of knowing as he closed his eyes and listened to the soft breathing of his family. He did not know that a battalion of soldiers was currently gathering just a few miles away and that they were being told the mission was a hiding place for the enemy. He did not know that the Red Cross he relied on was seen by the army as a target rather than a shield. He was sleeping in a sanctuary being surrounded. The shift in the atmosphere happened just as the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the trees. Samuel was woken by the rhythmic sound of heavy boots on the dry dirt of the road leading to the main gates. It was a low and steady thumping that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his head. He sat up and looked around, seeing the other refugees starting to stir. The air felt cold. A strange smell began to drift over the walls, a mixture of diesel exhaust and the sharp scent of gun oil that cut through the morning mist. Samuel could hear the sound of heavy engines idling just outside the gate and the sharp bark of military commands. He told himself it was just a routine check and that the soldiers would leave once they saw there were only civilians inside. He whispered to his wife to stay quiet and keep the children on the floor. The self-deception that had kept Samuel going for weeks began to crumble as the first sounds of glass breaking echoed from the main office. He realized that the soldiers were not stopping at the gate, but were pushing into the heart of the mission grounds. He believed that if he could talk to the commander, he could explain that they were only peaceful families seeking refuge. He wanted to believe in the logic of the world, even as he saw the guns. The first tongue of the nightmare began when the soldiers started to fire their weapons into the air to scatter the crowd. People began to scream and run in every direction, and the fragile sense of peace was instantly replaced by a wave of pure and unadulated panic. Samuel grabbed his children and tried to lead them toward the interior of the main parish building, believing that the brick walls would offer more protection than the thin fabric of the tents. He could see the soldiers moving through the camp with a mechanical ferocity that suggested they were not looking for enemies, but were simply looking to destroy. They were kicking over the cooking pots and slashing the tents with their bayonets. The sound of the gunfire became more frequent, and the screams of the wounded began to fill the morning air. Samuel pushed his family into the hallway of the parish house and told them to lie flat on the floor. The escalation continued into the second tongue of breaking point as the soldiers followed the crowd into the church buildings. They ignored the pleas of the priests and the nuns who stood in the doorways with their hands raised in peace. Samuel watched through a crack in the door as the soldiers began to fire directly into the mass of people who were huddled together in the pews. The air was filled with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. He realized that there was nowhere left to run, and that the sanctuary he had sought was now a trap with no exit. He clutched his youngest daughter to his chest and whispered a final prayer as the sound of heavy boots approached the room where they were hiding. The door was kicked open with a violent crash, and a group of soldiers stood in the doorway, their faces hidden by the shadows and the smoke. They were not men, they were the instruments of a regime. The third tongue of the dark spiral was the most brutal of all, as the soldiers began to systematically execute the people inside the parish house. They moved from room to room, with a cold and professional efficiency that left no room for mercy or hesitation. Samuel felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as a bullet found its mark, and he fell to the floor, covering his children with his own body. He could hear the rhythmic sound of the shots and the heavy thuds. The floor of the mission was soon covered in a layer of red that was darker than the dust of the plains. Samuel lay perfectly still, holding his breath as the soldiers walked past him, their boots splashing in the liquid that was pooling around the bodies. He could hear the sound of his own heart beating against the wooden floorboards, a fast and frantic sound that seemed loud enough to betray him. He was a witness to a crime that the world would never record. If you were standing in that hallway with Samuel, you would have felt the coldness of the floor and the overwhelming weight of the bodies pressing against you. You would have smelled the thick scent of iron and the sharp bite of the gunpowder that hung in the air like a heavy shroud. The silence that followed the gunfire was not a peaceful thing, but was a heavy and suffocating void that was filled with the ghosts of the hundreds who had just been silenced. The soldiers spent the rest of the morning searching the buildings for any survivors and looting the few belongings that the refugees had brought with them. They laughed as they shared the food that the priests had prepared for the children, and they used the mission furniture to start a fire in the yard. They were men who had been stripped of their humanity, and they viewed the death they had caused as nothing more than a part of their daily routine for the army. Samuel lay in the darkness of the parish house for hours, his body numb and his mind struggling to process the scale of the horror he had witnessed. He could hear the soldiers moving outside, but he refused to move until the sound of the engines finally faded away into the distance. He was the only one in his room who was still breathing, and the weight of that survival was a burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. He was a teacher without school. I have reflected on this story many times, and what haunts me is how the international community looked away while this was happening. The Cold War was the primary concern of the world, and the lives of the people in the West Nile were seen as a secondary issue that did not warrant intervention. It is a reminder that the silence of the world can be just as deadly as the bullets of the soldiers when it allows a regime to act with total and absolute impunity. The aftermath of the Ambachi Mission massacre led to a slow and painful recovery for the survivors in the region. Many of the families never returned to their homes, choosing instead to live in the exile of the refugee camps across the border. Samuel eventually found work as a teacher again, but he was a man who had seen too much, and his voice was always tinged with a deep and quiet sadness. He dedicated his life to telling the story of the mission to anyone. The offender profile for the UNLA soldiers involved in the attack shows a military that was deeply divided by ethnic animosity and a complete lack of discipline. Most of the men were never identified or brought to trial for their roles in the massacre, and they simply disappeared back into the ranks of the National Army. The commanders who ordered the Scorched Earth campaign lived out their lives in positions of power long after the violence had finally ended. Within the peaceful and repainted walls of the mission in 2026, the Ambachi Catholic Mission still stands as a place of worship and service for the people of the West Nile. The bullet holes have been patched, and the walls have been repainted, but the memory of that morning in 1981 is still etched into the hearts of the community. A small memorial plaque lists the names of those who were lost, but many of the victims remain nameless, buried in the red soil of the mission grounds forever. Samuel Atiku passed away several years ago, but his words remain a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute darkness. He believed that the only way to prevent such a tragedy from happening again was to ensure that the world never forgot the names of the dead and the price that was paid for the silence of the international community. The white walls of the mission continue to shine in the African sun, a symbol of peace and pain. They sought sanctuary in a place of peace, only to find a choir of machine guns. The white walls of the Ambasi mission eventually became a quiet tomb, standing still under the vast and indifferent sky of East Africa. But while the dust was settling over the graves in Uganda, a different kind of horror was waiting in the shadows of a quiet park in Munich. We are moving from the open plains of a war zone to the festive lights of a world-famous celebration where a single pipe bomb was about to turn a night of laughter into a scene of blood. On the evening of September 26, 1980, a 21-year-old student named Gundolf Kohler stood near the main entrance of the Munich Oktoberfest, holding a heavy pipe bomb hidden inside a fire extinguisher. The lights of the Ferris wheel spun in the distance, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted almonds and spilled beer. It was the busiest night of the festival, and thousands of people were moving through the gates into the light. Kohler was a geology student who had driven to Munich from his small hometown with a dark purpose that contradicted the joyful chaos around him. He stood by a public trash bin just outside the Theresienwiese fairgrounds, watching the crowd with a vacant expression. No one paid him any attention, because on a night like this, a young man standing alone was just another face in a sea of millions. The ground vibrated with the heavy rhythm of the traditional brass bands. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand what Oktoberfest means to the city of Munich in the autumn. It is a time when the entire world feels like a small village, and the beer tents are filled with the sounds of strangers becoming friends over giant glass mugs. The air is always cool and crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and hearty food. For the people of Bavaria, this is the most important 2 weeks of the entire year and a time for deep celebration. Among the crowd that evening was a group of friends who had traveled from a nearby town just to experience the Friday night rush. They were wearing their best traditional clothes and laughing about the songs they were going to sing once they found a seat in one of the massive tents. They were at that perfect age where the world feels safe, and every celebration feels like it will last forever. They were a community of joy moving toward a night of absolute magic. One of the young men in the group was a student who had just passed his exams, and this trip was his reward for months of hard work. He had saved his money specifically for this night, wanting to buy a round of drinks for all his friends. He was the kind of person who always looked for the humor in every situation, and his laughter was infectious to everyone around him. To him, the festival was a sanctuary where nothing bad could ever happen to anyone in the crowd. His girlfriend walked beside him, her hand tucked into his and her heart full of the excitement of the fair. She loved the way the lights of the rides reflected in the puddles on the ground and the way the music seemed to follow them wherever they went. They had been planning this date for weeks, and they had even matched their outfits to celebrate the occasion. They felt like they were in the middle of a movie where everyone was happy and the night was endless. They spent the early evening wandering through the stalls, looking at the hand-painted gingerbread hearts and the colorful toys. They bought a bag of roasted nuts to share, feeling the warmth of the paper bag against their hands in the cool night air. The festival was a tapestry of sights and sounds that felt eternal and solid, like the mountains that stood in the distance. They were surrounded by thousands of people who felt exactly the same sense of profound peace. What most people do not realize is that the entrance to the Oktoberfest is a place of transition where the city of Munich meets the dream world of the festival. It is a bottleneck of energy where people are either arriving with high expectations or leaving with full hearts. The trash bins near the gates are always overflowing with discarded wrappers and empty bottles, creating a mundane backdrop for the millions of memories that are made there every single season. The friends reach the main gate around 10 o'clock, and they stopped for a moment to take a photograph to remember the night. They posed in front of the giant archway, smiling for a camera that was held by a passing stranger. They didn't have a worry in the world, and their only concern was whether they would be able to find a table in their favorite beer tent. They were a part of a beautiful human machine that was built on the foundation of shared fun and music. The young man looked at his watch and realized they were running a bit late to meet another group of classmates near the Statue of Bavaria. He urged his friends to move a bit faster, promising them that the first drink of the night would be on him. He felt a sense of immense gratitude for his life and the people who were in it. He was a man who believed in the goodness of society and the safety of his home city during this historic and very special celebration. They walked past a young man standing near a trash bin who seemed to be struggling with a heavy metal cylinder. They barely gave him a second glance, assuming he was just a worker or someone disposing of a piece of equipment from one of the stalls. The mundane nature of the scene was a perfect camouflage for the horror that was about to unfold. They were so close to the entrance that they could hear the clinking of the glasses inside the festive beer tents. The air was filled with the smell of the damp earth and the sweet scent of the sugar from the nearby candy stands. It was a sensory overload that usually meant a night of absolute freedom. The group of friends felt a surge of adrenaline as they stepped onto the main thoroughfare of the festival. They were ready for the music and the dancing and the shared humanity of the Munich night. They felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be at that moment. And this is the part that the crowd had absolutely no way of knowing as they pushed through the turnstiles and laughed with the security guards. They did not know that the metal cylinder the young man was holding was not a tool, but was a vessel of destruction designed to tear through flesh and bone. They didn't know that the trash bin next to them was about to become the epicenter of the deadliest act of right-wing terrorism in the history of modern Germany. The young man Kohler was not just a student, he was a member of a radical group that wanted to use violence to change the political landscape of the country. He had spent months building the device and testing its components in the basement of his home. He believed that the festival was a symbol of everything he hated, and that by striking at the heart of the celebration, he could spark a revolution. He was a man possessed by a dark and cold ideology of total hate. He looked at the families and the children moving past him, but he saw them only as targets in a larger game. He had no empathy for the joy that surrounded him, and his only focus was on the timer that was ticking down in his pocket. He was a ghost in the machine of the festival, a presence that was as silent as it was deadly. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, waiting for the moment when the crowd would be at its most vulnerable and peak density. The shift in the atmosphere happened in a fraction of a second when a sudden flash of light illuminated the archway of the main gate. It was a white and blinding glare that seemed to erase the colors of the festival for a single heartbeat. The music seemed to stop, and the laughter was replaced by a heavy and suffocating silence that was more terrifying than any noise. It was a moment of absolute stillness before the laws of physics began to reassert themselves. A witness standing just a few yards away would later say that they thought it was just a very loud firework that had gone off prematurely to signal the end of the evening. They told themselves that the festival organizers were just trying something new, or that a transformer had blown in one of the rides. This self-deception was the only way the mind could process the scale of the shock. They wanted to believe the world was still a place of celebration and fun. But the smell that followed the flash was not the smell of black powder from a firework. It was the sharp and chemical bite of high explosives mixed with the metallic scent of iron and the smell of ozone. The air suddenly felt hot and thick, like a physical weight pressing against the skin. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tilt, and the world was suddenly out of focus. The silence was broken by the sound of glass falling like rain onto the cold pavement. The first tongue of the nightmare began when the sound of the blast finally hit the ears of the people in the beer tents. It was a deep and guttural roar that made the heavy glass mugs jump on the tables. Inside the tents, the music continued for a few more seconds because the bands couldn't see the chaos at the gates. But the people near the entrance were already living in a different reality. The world of the festival had been torn open by a force of pure hate. The escalation continued into the second tongue of the dark spiral as the smoke began to clear and the true scale of the carnage became visible. The area around the trash bin was a landscape of metal fragments and broken bodies. The blast wave had been so powerful that it had shattered the windows of the nearby shops and turned the gravel of the walkway into deadly projectiles. The screams for help were now a constant and rhythmic sound that filled the night air. The group of friends who had been laughing just seconds before were now scattered across the ground. The young man who had promised to buy the first round of drinks was lying in the dust, his traditional clothes torn and his eyes wide with shock. He couldn't feel his legs, and the world was spinning in a circle of red and black. He looked for his girlfriend, but the smoke was too thick, and the light of the festival was now a series of flickering shadows in the dark. The third tongue of the dark spiral reached its peak. The first responders arrived and found that the bomber himself was among the dead. Gundolf Kohler had been standing too close to the device when it detonated, and his body had been torn apart by the very force he had unleashed. The investigators found his identification card in the rubble, along with the remains of the fire extinguisher. The hunter had been consumed by his own trap in the middle of the crowd. If you were standing at that gate, you would have felt the coldness of the night returning as the heat of the blast faded away. You would have heard the sound of the sirens getting louder and the desperate shouts of the parents looking for their children in the dark. The air was filled with a fine dust that tasted of stone and chemicals, coating everything in a layer of gray. The festive lights of the Ferris wheel were now a cruel reminder of the joy that was gone. I have looked into many cold cases, but the detail that haunts me most about the Oktoberfest bombing is the sheer randomness of the victims. Among the 13 dead were families from overseas and local students who were just trying to enjoy a Friday night. They were people who had no connection to politics or the ideology of the bomber. They were just casualties of a man who decided that his personal hatred was more important than the lives of 1,000 others. The police initially claimed that Kohler was a lone wolf who had acted out of personal frustration and a desire for fame. They ignored the evidence of his connections to the right-wing extremist group Wehrsport Group Hoffmann, choosing instead to close the case as quickly as possible. This official narrative was a secondary injury to the survivors, who knew that a crime of this scale could not have been planned and executed by a single university student alone. Forensic experts who examined the remnants of the pipe bomb found that it was a highly sophisticated device that required a level of technical skill that Kohler did not possess. They found traces of military-grade explosives that were not easily available to the general public. This evidence suggested that there were others involved in the preparation of the attack, others who were still at large, while the city of Munich mourned its dead in the cold autumn rain. The investigation was hampered by a lack of political will to confront the rise of right-wing extremism in West Germany during the 1980s. The authorities were more concerned with the left-wing Red Army faction, and they downplayed the threat of groups like the Hoffmann organization. This bias allowed many of the people who may have assisted Kohler to disappear back into the shadows, where they continued to plan their dark and violent revolution. For the survivors, the night of September 26th was a date that divided their lives into two parts. They spent years in physical therapy and psychiatric treatment trying to rebuild what the bomb had destroyed in a single second. The young man who lost his legs that night became an advocate for victims' rights, reminding the government that justice is not just a verdict in a courtroom, but is a commitment to the truth regardless of the political cost or time. The families of the victims held a memorial every year at the gates of the festival, refusing to let the memory of their loved ones be forgotten by a city that wanted to move on. They collected their own evidence and interviewed witnesses who had been ignored by the police, building a case for a new investigation. Their persistence was a form of slow and steady justice, a refusal to accept the easy lie of a lone wolf who had died at the scene of the crime that night. In 2014, the German federal prosecutor finally reopened the investigation into the Oktoberfest bombing, citing new evidence and the need for a more comprehensive look at the right-wing connections. While the new investigation did not lead to Butki new arrests, it officially acknowledged the political nature of the attack and the failures of the original police work. It was a late but necessary step toward the truth for a nation that was still healing. The aftermath of the bombing led to a permanent change in the security of the Oktoberfest. The entrance is now heavily guarded, and the trash bins have been replaced with transparent bags to ensure that nothing can be hidden inside them. The festival continues to draw millions of people every year, but the shadow of 1980 remains a part of the landscape. The names of the 13 victims are recorded on a bronze monument near the main gate of the park. Gundolf Kohler is remembered only as a symbol of the dark capacity for human radicalization. His family home was searched several times over the years, but his parents maintained that they knew nothing of his political activities or his plans for the bomb. The group he belonged to was eventually banned by the government, but the ideology that fueled his hate continues to simmer in the quiet corners of the internet and the fringes of modern European politics. As the crowds gather once more under the festive lights of Munich in 2026, the case is officially closed once again, but the questions about the true extent of the conspiracy remain. New DNA technology has been used to examine the evidence from the scene, but the passage of time has made it difficult to find conclusive answers. The survivors are now elderly, but their commitment to the memory of that night is as strong as it was 46 years ago. They are the living witnesses to a story that has no happy ending. The party at the Oktoberfest didn't end with a traditional toast to friendship or a song about the beauty of life in Bavaria, but it ended with a scream that Germany still hears today. It was a sound that shattered the illusion of safety and replaced it with a permanent sense of vigilance. The echoes of that explosion still ring in the ears of the survivors every time they hear a firework or a loud noise in the night. It was the end of a world for many people. The festive lights of Munich faded into a gray and heavy morning, leaving a scar on the heart of Bavaria that time could never fully heal. But while the investigation in Germany was hitting a wall of silence, another strange and political storm was brewing in the remote islands of the South Pacific. We are moving from the cold streets of Europe to the tropical heat of Vanuatu, where a rebellion was about to be fueled by a mix of indigenous pride and corporate greed. In the early weeks of June 1980, a 60-year-old bearded tribal leader named Jimmy Stevens stood on a wooden platform in the middle of a dense tropical jungle on the island of Espiritu Santo. He was surrounded by hundreds of followers who were carrying a strange mix of ancient wooden spears and modern rifles. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke as he declared himself the president of a brand new nation called Vemerana. The proclamation was the beginning of a bizarre and dangerous conflict that would soon draw in the attention of international intelligence agencies and private corporate interests from across the globe. Jimmy Stevens believed that he was leading his people to a future of true independence and land rights. But beneath the surface of the rebellion lay a shadowy network of foreign funding that was designed to destabilize the young nation of Vanuatu before it could even begin. Jimmy Stevens was a man of complex heritage and immense charisma who had spent decades fighting for the rights of the indigenous people of the New Hebrides. He was the founder of the Nagriamo movement, which sought to return the land to its traditional owners and to protect the local culture from the influence of the British and French colonial authorities. He lived in a small village, surrounded by his many wives and children, and he was seen as a king by his followers. The island of Espiritu Santo was a place of wild beauty, with towering mountains and deep valleys that were hidden by the thick canopy of the rainforest. The air was always humid and warm, carrying the scent of tropical flowers and the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the coral reefs. To the people who lived there, the land was a sacred thing, and Jimmy Stevens was the one man who had the courage to stand up and defend it against the outsiders who wanted to buy it. During the 1970s, the New Hebrides was preparing for its independence from the joint rule of Britain and France. This period of transition was a time of great hope, but it was also a time of deep uncertainty and political division. Jimmy Stevens felt that the new government in the capital city of Vila was too closely aligned with foreign interests, and that his own people would be forgotten in the rush to modernize. He began to look for ways to secure his island. What most people do not realize is that Jimmy Stevens was not acting alone in his desire for a separate state. He had been approached by a group of American libertarians called the Phoenix Foundation, which was led by a millionaire named Michael Oliver. These men wanted to find a place in the world where they could create a tax haven with no government interference or social laws. They saw Jimmy and his Nagriamel movement as the perfect vehicle for their own private experiment. The Phoenix Foundation provided Jimmy Stevens with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and modern communication equipment to help him organize his rebellion. They promised him that if he could gain control of the island, they would bring in investment and technology that would make Wemarana the most prosperous nation in the South Pacific. Jimmy was a man who understood the value of land, but he was not prepared for the complex and hidden motives of the men from the West. His personal life was deeply intertwined with the politics of the island, and his house in the village of Vanafo became the headquarters for the Nagriamel movement. He spent his days holding meetings with tribal chiefs and his nights listening to the radio broadcasts from the outside world. He felt a sense of immense pride in the strength of his followers, and he believed that the spirits of his ancestors were watching over him as he prepared for the coming fight for freedom. He often spoke to his children about the importance of the land and the need to protect their traditions from the influence of the modern world. He was a father and a grandfather who wanted to ensure that his family would always have a place to call their own. He was a man who lived simply, but his dreams were as vast as the ocean that surrounded his home. He believed that he was a chosen leader who had been given the task of leading his people back to a state of grace. The village of Vanafo was a bustling center of activity where people from across the island gathered to hear Jimmy speak. The air was filled with the sound of drums and the rhythmic chanting of the Nagriamel supporters. There was a sense of profound solidarity among the crowd as they prepared for the independence celebrations that were scheduled for July 1980. They felt like they were on the verge of a new era where the people of Santo would finally be the masters. Jimmy had even traveled to the United States to meet with his financial backers, and he was impressed by the wealth and the power of the men who supported his cause. He saw the tall buildings and the shiny cars, and he imagined a similar future for his own people. He felt a sense of confidence that he had never felt before, believing that with the help of the Phoenix Foundation, he could build a paradise on Earth. He was a man who was ready to challenge the colonial powers. And this is the part that he had absolutely no way of knowing as he sat in his wooden house and looked out at the green mountains of his island. He did not know that the men who were giving him money cared nothing for the rights of the indigenous people or the preservation of their culture. He did not know that he was being used as a pawn in a larger game of corporate greed and political instability. He thought he had found allies, but he had actually found his own undoing. I have spent a lot of time studying the history of the South Pacific, and the detail that haunts me most about this story is the sheer contrast between the two worlds that collided on Santo. You had tribal leaders who lived by the laws of nature and the ancestors, and you had millionaires from the United States who lived by the laws of profit and loss. It was a clash of civilizations that was bound to end in tragedy for those who were caught in the middle of the dark game. The transition from a peaceful movement to an armed rebellion happened in the weeks leading up to the official independence of Vanuatu. Jimmy Stevens realized that the new government was not going to negotiate with him and that his dream of a separate state was in jeopardy. He decided that the only way to protect his land was to take it by force before the new authorities could establish their control. He gave the order to his followers to prepare for the final takeover. The shift in the energy of the island was sudden and chilling for those who were not part of the movement. One morning, the residents of the main town of Luganville woke up to find that the roads had been blocked by groups of men carrying traditional weapons and wearing the Nagriamel uniform. The air was thick with a new kind of tension that felt like the stillness before a massive storm. The sound of the birds in the jungle seemed to fade away into a heavy and quiet void. A strange smell of diesel fuel and gun oil began to drift over the town as the rebels moved into the government buildings and the airport. They were no longer the peaceful farmers that people had known for years. They were now soldiers of a new and unrecognized nation. The sight of the American flag flying alongside the Nagriamel banner was a confusing and unsettling thing for the local people. The rules of the island had been replaced by the rules of the rebellion. The self-deception that had kept the colonial authorities from acting earlier began to fracture as they realized that they had lost control of the island. They told themselves that Jimmy Stevens was just making a political statement and that he would eventually come to the table for talks. They believed that the French and the British would send in troops to restore order, but the two nations were too busy arguing with each other to take butt-key decisive action at the time. The first tongue of the nightmare began when the rebels seized the central radio station and began to broadcast the Declaration of Independence for Wemarana. Jimmy Stevens spoke to the people of the island in a voice that was full of power and authority, telling them that the old world was gone and a new era had begun. He told the foreign residents that they were welcome to stay as long as they respected the new laws, but he also made it clear that those who resisted. The escalation continued into the second tongue of the breaking point, as the rebellion spread to the other islands in the northern part of the chain. Small groups of Nagriamel supporters began to harass the supporters of the new government and to burn the property of those who they saw as traitors. The sense of community that had held the islands together for centuries was being torn apart by the new borders and the new loyalties. The air was filled with the smell of smoke. The third tang of the dark spiral reached its peak when the newly independent government of Vanuatu realized that they had no army of their own to stop the rebellion. They were forced to call on their neighbors for help, and a task force from Papua New Guinea, known as the Kumul Force, was sent to the island to restore order. The arrival of the foreign troops turned the rebellion into a full-scale military conflict that threatened to engulf the entire region. If you were standing on the docks of Luganville when the Papua New Guinean ships arrived, you would have felt the ground shake from the sound of the heavy engines and the rhythmic thumping of the boots. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and the sharp smell of gunpowder as the troops began to move into the town. The rebels tried to hold their ground with their spears and their old rifles, but they were no match for the professional soldiers of the task force. The fighting moved from the town into the dense jungle of the interior, where the rebels had a tactical advantage. The sounds of the jungle were replaced by the sharp crack of rifle fire and the heavy thud of mortar rounds. Jimmy Stevens moved his headquarters to a remote village in the mountains, believing that the terrain would protect him from the advancing troops. He watched as his dream of a separate state was being dismantled by the very force he had tried to avoid. The detail that haunts me most about the final days of the rebellion is the way the foreign investors from the Phoenix Foundation simply vanished when the first shots were fired. They had promised Jimmy Stevens that they would stand by him until the end, but as soon as the military arrived, they boarded their private yachts and sailed away to the safety of the international waters. They left the tribal leader to face the consequences of a war that they helped to start. The soldiers of the Kumul Force were efficient and methodical as they moved from village to village, searching for the rebel leaders. They used their superior technology to track the movements of the Nagriamel followers and to cut off their lines of communication and supply. The resistance began to crumble as the people of the island realized that the promised help from the outside world was never coming. The reality of the situation was as cold as the steel of the guns. Jimmy Stevens was eventually captured in late August 1980 after a brief standoff in his mountain hideout. He was led away in handcuffs, his once proud beard matted with the dust of the jungle and his eyes filled with a deep sense of betrayal. He looked at the soldiers who were half his age, and he realized that the world had changed in ways that he could no longer understand. He was no longer a president. He was a prisoner of the state he had tried to defy. The search of his headquarters revealed the extent of the foreign involvement in the rebellion. The authorities found thousands of dollars in American currency, along with maps of the island that had been drawn by the Phoenix Foundation investors. They also found evidence of a planned tax haven that would have excluded the local people from the wealth of their own land. The dream of independence had been a cover for a corporate takeover that would have destroyed the island. The trials of the rebel leaders were held in Vila, and they were followed by the entire nation with a sense of grim fascination. Jimmy Stevens was sentenced to 14 years in prison for his role in the rebellion and for the illegal possession of weapons. He accepted his fate with a quiet dignity, refusing to testify against the men who had abandoned him. He spent his years in a small cell, looking out at the ocean and thinking about the land that he had tried to save. The aftermath of the Santo Rebellion led to a period of intense national unity as the people of Vanuatu realized the importance of a strong and unified central government. The new nation was able to establish its sovereignty and to gain recognition from the international community despite the efforts of the foreign investors to destabilize it. The Nagriamel movement was suppressed, and the land rights that Jimmy Stevens had fought for were eventually addressed by law. The surrogate commentary that I can offer here is that the story of Vemerana is a powerful reminder of the dangers of outside interference in the affairs of a young nation. We often see tribal or local movements being co-opted by corporate interests that have their own hidden agendas. It is a tragedy that occurs when the genuine desires of a people for independence are used as a tool for those who only care about their own profit. It is a cycle that repeats in history. The offender profile for Jimmy Stevens is a study in the tragedy of a leader who was caught between two different eras. He was a man who genuinely loved his people and his land, but he was blinded by his own ambition and the false promises of the millionaires from the West. He died in prison in 1994 after serving 11 years of his sentence. He was never able to return to his village as a free man, and his dream of Vemerana died with him in that cell. In the independent and sovereign islands of Vanuatu, as they stand in 2026, Vanuatu is a thriving and stable nation that has maintained its independence and its unique cultural identity. The island of Espiritu Santo is a popular destination for tourists who come to see the beautiful beaches and the lush jungles, but the history of the rebellion is still a part of the local memory. The Nagriamel movement has been revived as a peaceful political party that continues to advocate for the land rights of the people. The Phoenix Foundation and the millionaires who funded the rebellion were never brought to justice for their roles in the conflict. They continued to search for other islands in the world where they could try to build their libertarian paradise, but they were never able to find another leader like Jimmy Stevens. Their names are a footnote in the history of the South Pacific, but the damage they caused to the lives of the people on Santo is a debt that can never be repaid. He thought he was building a kingdom of tradition, but he was just a pawn in a corporate game. The tropical sun of Vanuatu eventually set over the quiet mountains of Santo, leaving behind a nation that was scarred but still standing strong in the Pacific. But while the islands were finding their peace, a different kind of tragedy was smoldering in the dark corners of a nightclub in the heart of Dublin City. We are moving from the jungle rebellions of the South to the cold streets of Ireland, where a night of music was about to be turned into a literal cage of fire. The tropical sun of Vanuatu eventually set over the quiet mountains of Santo, leaving behind a nation that was scarred but still standing strong in the Pacific. But while the islands were finding their peace, a different kind of tragedy was smoldering in the dark corners of a nightclub in the heart of Dublin City. We are moving from the jungle rebellions of the South to the cold streets of Ireland, where a night of music was about to be turned into a literal cage of fire. On the cold Valentine's night of February 14, 1981, an 18-year-old girl named Paula Lewis put on her favorite dress and headed to the Stardust nightclub in Artane, Dublin. The streets of the Irish capital were dusted with a light frost, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter from couples walking hand in hand. Paula was meeting her friends for a disco dancing competition, and her mind was full of the music and the bright lights. The Stardust was more than just a nightclub to the people of North Dublin. It was the beating heart of their social lives. In 1981, Ireland was a place where community meant everything, and the youth of Artane spent their entire week looking forward to Friday nights. The building was a massive converted factory that could hold over 800 people, and on this particular night, it was packed to the rafters with teenagers celebrating the holiday. Paula Lewis was a bright and energetic young woman who loved the energy of the dance floor. She had spent hours getting ready with her sisters, sharing makeup and stories about the boys they hoped to see at the club. Her family lived just a few streets away, and the Stardust felt like an extension of her own home. There was a sense of safety in the familiar faces of the bouncers and the regular crowd that gathered under the spinning disco balls and neon lights. The atmosphere inside the club was electric as the DJ played the latest pop hits and the dance floor became a sea of moving bodies. Paula felt a sense of pure joy as she moved to the rhythm, surrounded by her closest friends. They were all at that beautiful age where the world feels limitless and the future is just a series of exciting possibilities. No one was thinking about the history of the building or the safety regulations being ignored by the owners of the place. Dublin in the early 80s was a city of narrow streets and warm hearts, but it was also a place where corners were often cut to save a few pounds. The owners of the Stardust were proud of their successful business, and they were constantly looking for ways to maximize their profits. They had recently noticed that some local kids were trying to sneak into the club through the emergency exits to avoid paying the entrance fee. To them, this was a major financial problem. In their minds, the solution was simple and effective. They decided to use heavy metal chains and padlocks to secure the emergency exit doors from the inside during the peak hours of operation. They believed that this would force everyone to go through the main entrance, where they could be properly screened and charged. It was a decision made in a boardroom based on ledger books and profit margins, with no thought given to what might happen if the exit was needed. Paula and her friends were having the time of their lives as the clock ticked toward 2 o'clock in the morning. The energy in the room was reaching a fever pitch, and the heat from the hundreds of dancing bodies was rising toward the ceiling. They were completely immersed in the music and the shared experience of being young and free. The Stardust was their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the gray skies of Dublin and feel like they were part of a dream. The club was decorated with hundreds of paper hearts and red streamers that hung from the ceiling, creating a festive and romantic atmosphere. Paula had just finished a dance and was laughing with her sister about the clumsy moves of a boy they had met earlier. They felt completely at home in the crowded space, surrounded by people who had grown up in the same housing estates. The music was so loud that you could feel the bass vibrating in your very chest and bones. And this is the part that she had absolutely no way of knowing, as she laughed and spun around on the crowded floor. She did not know that just a few meters away, behind a thick polyester curtain, a small spark had landed on a stack of plastic chairs. She had no way of knowing that the very doors she had walked past on her way in were now wrapped in cold steel chains. To her, those doors represented safety and a way out, but in reality, they had become part of a wall. The transition from a celebration to a tragedy began with a small wisp of smoke that drifted from a cordoned-off area of the seating. At first, a few people noticed a strange smell, but they assumed it was just a special effect from the stage, or perhaps someone had dropped a cigarette. The music was so loud that no one could hear the soft crackle of the flames as they began to eat through the foam padding of the chairs. The dance floor remained crowded and busy. The smell of burning plastic became more intense, and a thin layer of gray haze started to settle over the dancers. One of the waitresses noticed a glow coming from behind a curtain, and she moved to investigate, thinking a light had been left on. When she pulled the fabric back, she was met with a wall of intense heat and a flash of orange light that made her stagger backward. The fire had been smoldering in the shadows for several minutes, and now it had found air. Paula felt a sudden change in the air as a wave of heat rolled across the dance floor. She looked up and saw that the ceiling tiles were starting to melt and drop like burning rain onto the people below. The music stopped abruptly, and for a single heartbeat, there was a terrifying silence that was broken only by the sound of the fire roaring toward the rafters. The disco lights continued to spin, casting a surreal glow on the faces of the teenagers who were confused. The first tongue of the nightmare was the sudden loss of light as the main power failed and plunged the club into total darkness. The only visibility came from the orange glow of the growing fire, which was now racing across the carpeted walls. Paula grabbed her friend's hand and began to push toward the nearest exit sign, but the crowd was already a chaotic mass of screaming people. The smoke was thick and black, filling their lungs and making it impossible to see or breathe. If you were in that room, you would have felt the heat pressing against your skin like a physical weight, and the air tasting of burnt chemicals and molten plastic. The sound of the screaming was a constant wall of noise that made it impossible to think or hear your own voice. The floor was slippery with spilled drinks and the bodies of those who had tripped in the dark. The sense of sight was completely gone, replaced by a world of shifting shadows and orange light. They reached the first emergency exit and found a crowd of people pushing against the handles with all their might. Paula watched in horror as the men at the front of the line screamed that the door was locked. She could hear the sound of heavy metal chains clanking against the steel frame as people kicked and clawed at the barrier. The second tongue of the breaking point was the realization that they were trapped inside a building that was now a giant and hot oven. The heat was so intense that the hair on Paula's arms began to singe, and the air felt like it was made of liquid fire. She moved toward another exit, only to find the same scene of desperation and terror. People were piling up against the chained doors, their bodies crushed together as the fire moved closer. The third tongue of the dark spiral was the collapse of the roof as the steel beams buckled under the heat, sending a shower of burning debris onto the teenagers. Forensic investigators would later state that the fire reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees in just a few minutes. They found 48 victims in the aftermath, many of them clustered together, just inches away from the chained exit doors. The evidence of the padlocks and the heavy steel links was found among the charred remains of the doorway. It was a clear and devastating proof that the management had valued their revenue more than the lives. The aftermath for the families of North Dublin was a decades-long struggle for the truth. For 43 years, the official verdict on the fire was listed as arson by an unknown person, which allowed the owners to escape legal liability and insurance claims. The parents of the victims never gave up their fight for justice, attending court hearings and organizing protests year after year. They knew that their children had not died because of a ghost, but of a chain. With the long and painful battle for the truth finally reaching its end, the Stardust Fire remains the most significant tragedy in the history of the Irish state. In April of 2024, a new inquest finally delivered the verdict that the families had been waiting for nearly half a century. The jury ruled that the 48 young people were victims of unlawful killing, citing the locked exit doors and the flammable materials used in the club. The news brought a wave of emotional relief to the people. The site where the Stardust once stood is now a memorial park, where the names of the victims are engraved in stone. People still leave flowers and Valentine's cards at the gates every year, remembering the night when the music died. The owners of the club have long since passed away, but their legacy remains a cautionary tale for safety inspectors across the world. The fire changed the laws in Ireland forever, ensuring that no exit would ever be chained shut again. The final verdict of unlawful killing was not just a legal statement, but was a recognition of the truth that the families had known all along. They had fought for their children when the state turned its back, and they had won a victory that would protect future generations from the same fate. The night of Valentine's Day 1981 will never be forgotten in Dublin. They paid for their entry with a few coins, but the owners made them pay for the exit. I have reflected on this story many times, and what haunts me is the cold calculation of the chains. It wasn't an accident of nature or a random act of violence, but was a choice made by men who thought they could control the movements of others for a bit of extra money. It makes you realize that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who sit in comfortable offices and make decisions based on numbers, rather than the safety of the human beings they serve. The families of the 48 victims finally have the peace they deserve, knowing that the world acknowledges the truth of that terrible night. They spent 43 years in the wilderness of the legal system, but they never lost their voice or their resolve. The story of the Stardust is a testament to the power of a community that refuses to be silenced by the weight of the state. They paid for their entry with a few coins, but the owners made them pay for the exit with their lives. We have traveled a long and dark road tonight, from the frozen secrets of a Soviet apartment to the lawless waves of the Gulf, and finally to the chained doors of a Dublin nightclub. These stories remind us that the world is often a place of hidden dangers, where the people and structures we trust can fail us in the most horrific ways imaginable. It is a sobering thought to carry with us as we return to the safety of our own homes and the quiet of the night in the dark. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into the strange and mysterious side of our history. If these stories have stayed with you, I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue to shine a light on the cases that the world has tried to forget. Please take a moment to look around you and appreciate the peace of your surroundings, because as we have seen, everything can change. Remember to keep your doors locked and your eyes open as you navigate the world outside. The darkness has a way of creeping in when we least expect it, and the best defense is always a sharp mind and a cautious heart. I will be here waiting for you in the next episode, with more tales from the shadows that linger just beyond the reach of the light. Until then, stay safe and take care of those who matter most to you, because life is as fragile as a single and tiny flame. As the rain continues to fall outside and the world settles into a deep sleep, I hope you find the rest you need. But as you close your eyes, remember the stories we discussed tonight and the lessons they carry. The monsters of the past are never truly gone. They just wait for the next person to forget the importance of a clear path and a watchful eye. The shadows are long, and they are always moving just at the edge of your vision where the light cannot ever reach. Sleep well tonight and keep the world at a distance for a while. But never forget that even in the most familiar places, the exits might not be as open as they seem, and the person standing next to you might be holding a secret you were never meant to discover. The silence of the night is a gift, but it is also a mask for the things that move in the dark when everyone else is dreaming of a tomorrow that is never guaranteed. The heavy chains of the past are still here.